The alien girl took one look at the human. Everything she believed changed. The alarm was already screaming when I reached the observation deck. Red light pulsed across every corridor of Meridian Station, and the emergency channel was flooding with overlapping voices. Rethkai dispatchers, Velcon coordinators, a frantic Threnny engineer repeating the same 3 words in his own language. I pressed my 4-fingered hand against the cold viewport and looked down at Bay 9, where a thick greenish gas was already curling out from a fractured fuel line like smoke from something dying. My name is Sira Velton. I am 112 years old, which is considered quite young for my species. I have 2 doctorates in xenosociology and 1 in comparative cognition. I arrived on Meridian Station 4 days ago to observe the Joint Species Emergency Response Unit for a research paper I was writing on cross-species coordination failures. I had very clear expectations about what I would find. I was wrong about almost everything. The gas in Bay 9 was called Vellerite compound, toxic to most carbon-based life forms, though the window before it became lethal varied by species. A Rethkai crew member named Owen was trapped behind a pressure door that had sealed automatically when the line fractured. The automated rescue systems were offline. 3 conclave responders were suiting up at the far end of the corridor. I checked my comm device. 4 minutes before they could enter safely. I saw the human before I understood what he was doing. His name was Eli Dera. He was 29 years old, which is quite a lot for a human apparently. He was attached to the emergency response unit as a field medic. No augmentations, no neural implants, no secondary limbs, nothing that any species with real standing in the conclave would call impressive. He had brown eyes and a worn med kit on his belt, and a jacket with a small coffee stain near the collar that he had clearly not noticed or not cared about. I had noted him in my research log as Subject H7 when I first arrived. Average height for a human. Quiet. Moved through the station hallways without taking up much space. I had written the phrase, cognitively adequate, in my notes and moved on. Now he was standing at the entrance to Bay 9, looking at the gas readings on the wall panel. He was not suiting up. He was calculating something in his head. I could see it in the way his eyes moved, counting, measuring. Then he looked into the bay where Owen was slumped against the pressure door, barely conscious, and Eli made a decision that I am still not sure I have the correct words for. He went in. No suit. No protective gear beyond the jacket with the coffee stain. I stood up from my chair without realizing it. He moved fast and low through the gas, holding his breath, and when he reached Owen he did not simply grab him and drag him out. He checked Owen's breathing first. He checked his pulse. He looked at Owen's face with an expression that had nothing clinical in it at all, and then he got his arms under Owen's and pulled him toward the door in a way that kept Owen's head stable, because Eli had clearly read the Rethkai file and knew that a Rethkai's cranial structure did not handle sudden movement well during respiratory distress. He came out of the bay at 67 seconds. Owen was already coughing up the gas, which meant his airways were clear, which meant he was going to be fine. Eli set him down on the corridor floor, checked his vitals again, and then started coughing himself. Deep, painful coughs that bent him forward at the waist. His eyes were red. His hands were shaking. He did not sit down until he had confirmed Owen's oxygen levels on the portable monitor he pulled from his med kit, and then he sat down heavily against the wall and pressed the back of his wrist to his eyes. Director On of the Rethkai was standing 20 meters away. On was a senior conclave official who had spent the last several months building a political case for reclassifying humans as provisional members, stripping their full voting rights, limiting their access to conclave resources, essentially demoting them on the grounds that they were too short-lived and too irrational to be treated as equals. He had data. He had charts. He had a very convincing 40-slide presentation that I had reviewed and found, to my professional shame, largely accurate. He stared at Eli for a long time without speaking. I wrote nothing in my research log. For the first time since I arrived, I could not find the right words. I had spent the first 2 days on Meridian Station watching the emergency response unit run training exercises, and I had watched Eli in those exercises the way I watched everything, through glass, from a distance, with a stylus in my hand and a framework in my head that I had spent decades building. The framework said humans were a young species, clever enough to have survived, lucky enough to have found fire and then metal and then spaceflight, but fundamentally limited by their biology. Short lifespans meant shallow institutional memory. Emotional volatility meant poor decision-making under pressure. Physical fragility meant high dependency on tools and technology they had not developed independently. My framework was thorough and peer-reviewed, and had been cited 47 times in academic literature. On the first day of the training exercise, I watched Eli treat a Threnny crew member who had been hit by a falling beam in the simulation. The Threni are a species with strict social protocol around physical contact. Being touched by someone outside their bonded circle during a vulnerable moment is considered a serious violation, one that causes genuine psychological distress. The Rethkai responder in the simulation had grabbed the Threni without asking, and gotten a panicked scream in response that set the whole scenario back by 2 minutes. Eli stopped before he reached the Threni. He crouched down to eye level, which was a physically awkward position for him that clearly cost him time, and he said something quiet. The Threni, bleeding from a head wound in the simulation, in genuine distress, looked at him for a moment and then nodded. Eli worked quickly. He had the Threni stabilized in under 90 seconds. I frowned at my notes. I wrote, anomalous compliance from Threni subject, possible simulation artifact. I did not want to write what I was actually thinking, which was, how did he know to ask? Later that day I watched him treat a Velcon crew member, my own species, who had a damaged crystalline neural cluster. The standard conclave protocol for neural cluster trauma was neural stasis foam, which stabilizes the cluster but often causes partial geometry degradation that takes months to correct. There is a manual technique developed by a Velcon medic named Counselor Dean that preserves cluster geometry almost perfectly, but it is obscure and difficult, and almost never used by non-Velcon practitioners, because it requires precise knowledge of our neural anatomy that most other species simply do not have. Eli used it. He used it correctly. He did it fast enough that I missed the first 2 steps because I had looked down at my notes. I stood up from my chair again. I seemed to be doing that a lot. After the exercise, I found him in the corridor and approached him the way I approach all research subjects, formally, efficiently, with a specific list of questions. I asked how he knew the Velcon neural technique. He said a Velcon medic named Counselor Dean had published a paper on it 8 years ago in the Conclave Medical Archive. He had read the paper. He thought it seemed important. I asked why he had memorized the Threni contact protocols. He looked at me with a slightly puzzled expression, as if I had asked him why he breathed, and said, because they were there. What if I needed them? I asked how he made triage decisions so fast without a neural processor. Because my species uses implanted processors to run probability assessments in emergency situations. It allows us to allocate resources with mathematical precision, choosing who to treat first based on survival probability and resource cost. Eli was quiet for a moment. Then he said, you read the room. You look at people. You figure out who's the most scared, who's hiding pain, who's already starting to give up. You can feel it. I wrote in my log, anomalous intuitive processing, likely a compensation mechanism for limited cognition. That night I read his entire service record instead of working on my paper. He had been in 4 separate emergency situations in the last 3 years, where the calculated survival probability for the patient he treated was below 40%. He had treated all 4 successfully. The reports noted each time that he had acted before official assessment was complete, that he had used non-standard techniques, that he had taken personal risk that exceeded protocol guidelines. Each report also noted that the patient lived. I told Commander Yissa about what I had observed. Yissa was my superior officer on this posting, Velcon. Pragmatic, with a stillness about her that I had always interpreted as emotional distance and was beginning to suspect was something else entirely. She had worked alongside humans before. She had never mentioned it. She listened to me describe Eli's behavior with an expression I could not read, and when I finished she asked me what I thought was wrong with him. I said I believed he had a poorly calibrated risk assessment function, that his emotional responses were overriding his rational processing in ways that happened to produce good outcomes but were fundamentally unsound from a cognitive standpoint. Yissa was quiet for a moment, then she said, I thought the same thing. 15 years ago during the Vithara station collapse. She told me about it without any drama. A structure failure that killed over 400 people. It would have been twice that number if the joint response team hadn't worked around the clock for 9 days. The Velcon responders, she said, had been precise and effective. They calculated survival probabilities and allocated resources correctly. They knew when a situation was unrecoverable and moved on. They saved a great number of lives by being rational about which lives could be saved. The humans, she said, kept going back in, past the calculated threshold, past the point where the survival probability made further attempts worth the resource cost. Not because they failed to understand the math. They understood the math. They simply looked at the math and looked at the person still trapped in the rubble and chose to go back in anyway. I said that sounded like a cognitive malfunction. Yissa said she used to think so too. She said, I asked a human medic on that mission what it was, what she felt when she went back in. She thought about it for a while and then she said, I couldn't just leave them. I sat with that for a moment. Yissa said. I've thought about that sentence for 15 years. I couldn't just leave them. I calculated a higher probability of success on a second attempt. Not protocol required a recovery effort. I couldn't leave them. As if leaving them was physically impossible. As if their existence created an obligation in her that she had no mechanism for overriding. I said that sounded irrational. Yissa looked at me and said something I wrote down the moment I got back to my room. She said, maybe the most advanced thing a species can do isn't to outgrow the irrational. Maybe it's to make the irrational reliable. On the third day, the conclave session happened. Director An had been building toward this for months. The proposal was to reclassify humans as provisional members, not full expulsion from the conclave, but a significant reduction in their standing, limited voting rights, restricted access to conclave resources, a formal acknowledgement, enshrined in conclave law, that humans were a junior species not yet ready for the responsibilities of full membership. The arguments were clean and data-supported and, by the metrics the conclave had used to rank species for centuries, largely defensible. Humans lived short lives. Their institutional memory was fragmented across generations in ways that created policy inconsistency. Their emotional volatility made them unpredictable partners in long-term diplomatic arrangements. They had contributed meaningfully to conclave operations in the 43 years since their admission, but contribution and capacity were different things. I sat in the observer gallery and listened and thought about how good the arguments were, and felt something I did not have a Velcon word for, which was becoming a persistent problem. Then Eli Dera stood up. He had no standing to address the chamber. He was not a diplomat or a delegate or a conclave official of any kind. He was a field medic who had been on Meridian Station for 3 days running a training exercise and had somehow stayed long enough to walk into this session. But there is a procedural quirk in the conclave charter, a relic from its founding, when the framers believed strongly in the principle that any citizen of any member species should have access to the floor during open session. That allows exactly 3 minutes of floor time to any registered conclave visitor who requests it formally. Eli had apparently found this in the charter and submitted the request that morning. The chamber let him speak. I think some of them did it because they expected it to be easy to ignore. He stood at the floor podium with his worn jacket and his medkit on his belt, and he did not argue with Director An's data. He did not claim that humans were faster or stronger or longer lived or more rational or superior to any other species in any measurable way. He said, everything Director An said about us is true. We burn bright and we burn short. We make decisions with our stomachs half the time. We can't store memory the way a Velcon can, or process sensor data the way the Rethkai do. We lose people we love and we grieve in ways that interfere with our function for months. We know all of this. We have always known it. He paused, and the chamber was quiet in a way that chambers are not usually quiet. We just decided it didn't mean we had to stop showing up. He sat down. The vote failed. An's proposal did not pass. I watched the delegates from 40 civilizations, and I noticed that the ones who had worked directly alongside humans, in emergency response, in field operations, in the hard practical work that happens outside of chambers and data presentations, almost none of them voted in favor. They had a particular expression, the ones who had worked with humans before. I recognized it because I had been wearing it for 3 days without knowing what it was called. After the session ended, I went back to my room and opened my research log. I had come to Meridian Station to write a paper on cross-species coordination failures. I had planned to use the human contingent as a case study in the challenges of integrating cognitively limited species into high-functioning multi-species operational teams. I had a title already selected. I had an outline. I had 40 pages of notes organized under subheadings that I was now reading back to myself and finding hollow in ways I did not know how to quantify. I did not throw out my framework. I am a scientist. I do not throw out frameworks because they inconvenience me. But I added a new field to my research taxonomy. I had to invent it myself, because no existing Velcon academic term covered what I had observed. I called it volitional persistence beyond rational threshold, the capacity to continue acting in service of others past the point where a calculated mind would determine further action to be unsustainable or statistically unjustified. Not because the individual is unaware of the risk or incapable of calculating it, despite full awareness, despite complete understanding of the math, choosing to act anyway because the person on the other side of the decision exists, and their existence creates an obligation that the calculating mind cannot override. I noted in my log that this did not appear to be a malfunction. I looked at what I had written for a long time. Then I added one more line. I wrote, "It appears to be the feature." The next morning, Eli was already gone. His unit had been reassigned to a station in the outer ring, some new emergency, some new set of people who needed someone to show up for them. I found out from the unit's scheduling officer, a human woman named Claire who had the same kind of steadiness about her that Eli had, that kind of quiet that wasn't distance at all but something closer to readiness. Claire told me Eli had stayed up until 3 in the morning reading the medical files for the species stationed at his next posting, just in case. I stood in the corridor outside the scheduling office for a while after that. Meridian Station hummed around me, the usual sounds of 40 species coexisting in a space designed for none of them specifically. Everyone making adjustments, everyone accommodating. It had always struck me as a kind of controlled chaos. Now it struck me as something else. I thought about what it would mean to be a species that knew, clearly, scientifically, without illusion, that you were not the strongest or the fastest or the longest lived or the most rational. To know exactly where you ranked on every metric that the rest of the galaxy used to determine worth. To know that your body would wear out in decades while your colleagues lived for centuries, that your memory would fade and your institutions would lose continuity, and your emotional responses would complicate your decision-making in ways that more cognitively advanced species would find frustrating and sometimes embarrassing. And to decide, in full possession of that knowledge, to show up anyway, to read the files the night before, just in case, to ask permission before you touched someone, even when time was short, to go into the gas without a suit because the math said 90 seconds was enough, and the person behind the door could not wait 4 minutes. I have lived 112 years. In that time I have made a great number of careful, rational decisions. I have allocated resources correctly. I have assessed probabilities and acted accordingly. I have been, by every metric I was raised to value, a good and sensible person. I have never once gone into the gas without a suit. I walked back to my quarters and sat at my desk and opened a new document, not my research paper. Something else. I started writing about the first time I saw Eli Dera move through a simulation and stop before touching a Threnny who needed his help, about the way he crouched down to eye level in a position that cost him time, about the single quiet word he said and the way the Threnny nodded, about a man who read Counselor Dean's obscure paper 8 years ago and filed it away somewhere in his ordinary, unaugmented, beautifully limited human mind, and then pulled it out at exactly the moment it mattered, because he had always known that a moment like that might come. I did not know what I was writing yet. A paper, maybe, or something less formal than that, a record at least, a document that said, I came here believing one thing and I am leaving knowing something different, and the difference matters, and someone should write it down. My species can store memories with crystalline precision. We can recall a conversation from 90 years ago with perfect accuracy. Every word, every inflection, every detail of the room we were sitting in. We do not forget. It is one of the things that makes us, by the conclave's own assessment, a superior cognitive species. I found myself hoping that I would remember Eli Dera with that kind of precision. The coffee stain, the shaking hands after the gas, the way he sat down on the corridor floor and pressed the back of his wrist to his eyes, not because he was finished, but because he needed exactly 3 seconds to pull himself back together before he checked Owen's oxygen levels one more time. I found myself hoping that in 800 years, when I am old by the standards of even my own species, I will still be able to see that. I believe I will. Some things settle into you differently than others. Some things do not need a crystalline neural cluster to stay sharp. Some things you just could not leave behind.